Commentary about President Reagan and his Iranian arms crisis turned grim today. No sadder tale could be spun in this holiday season than the unraveling of yet another presidency, said Washington Post political writer David Broder. Anti-Reagan columnist Mary McGrory said the Reagan presidency would now be dissipated in a welter of hearings, snickers, questions, and rumors. Pro-Reagan columnist George Will said the immediate future and the ultimate reputation of the Reagan presidency are now on the line. In columns on the same op-ed page of the New York Times, Reagan critic Anthony Lewis spoke of yet another president having destroyed himself, while Reagan supporter William Safire expressed the hope the ransom scandal would turn out to be more of a Bay of Pigs than a Watergate. We look at what the ultimate fallout could be for the Reagan presidency now with three men of opinion. George McGovern, former Democratic senator from South Dakota and the 1972 Democratic nominee for president. Norman Podhoretz, syndicated columnist and editor of Commentary magazine. And from Atlanta, Hamilton Jordan, President Jimmy Carter's White House Chief of Staff and Chief Political Advisor. To you first, Hamilton Jordan, do you agree with David Broder when he says the Reagan presidency is unraveling?
Well, I hope not. President Reagan faces a serious problem. I hope that he will deal with it forthrightly, get all the facts out, hopefully get this behind him. He has 2 years left in his term. There are problems out there, deficits, trade deficits, opportunities in arms control. All of us want this president and every president to succeed. Still, he has a significant problem that must be dealt with immediately.
You say get the facts out. Is that all that it would take for him to keep his presidency intact and effective for the last 2 years?
Well, that's the first step. We have to see what those facts are. I think the appointment of the three-member panel to look into the foreign policy process of this administration is an important step in the right direction.
But then what?
Well, we have to see what they find. There's a lot of comment today, the search for the perfect process or the perfect organization. Every president is different, but you have to have three elements. You have to have a good policy, you have to have good people to implement that policy, and a president, either directly or indirectly, has to be able to monitor that implementation. In this case, President Reagan's public policy was of not selling arms to Iran. His private policy was to sell arms to Iran. The people implementing that policy in the White House were inept zealots. And ultimately, it looks as if President Reagan lacked a mechanism internally to monitor these goings-on.
What do you say to those who have said, oh my goodness, the Ayatollah Khomeini has now brought down his second United States president? Go ahead.
I hope that's not true. I hope that's not true. I hope that President Reagan can put this problem behind him, but there's quite a bit to do before that can happen.
But what was your reaction when you first heard that this has to do with dealing with Iran after, of course, you were intimately involved in the Carter administration's dealing with Iran? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, as a Democrat or as an American?
You go ahead, either way you want to go.
Well, I was disappointed from both perspectives. And a great irony that this problem that was so difficult for the administration and for the president I served has come back now 6 years later to create a problem for another administration and another president.
Yeah. All right, let's go now to George McGovern here in Washington. Senator, do you agree with Mary McGrory says that the Reagan presidency will now dissipate in a welter of hearings, snickers, questions, and rumors?
Jim, I've been thinking for the last 2 or 3 days about this issue, as most Americans have. I think the problem with trying to answer questions like that is that we really don't have all the facts. Every day there's some new development. Each night I've gone to bed thinking that I pretty well had my assessment of what was going on. Then you read the press the next morning and you find there's a whole new dimension to it. That's understandable if you consider that the president himself says that he doesn't have the facts, that he really didn't know what was going on in his administration. Secretary Schultz, the Secretary of State, said that he didn't know what was going on, that he hadn't been fully briefed. The Chief of Staff, Mr. Reagan, said that he didn't know about it. So if these people don't know the facts of what has been happening the last few weeks, it's very difficult for those of us on the outside to say we know what's wrong and this is how serious it is. I think what we need now is a dependable mechanism to focus the facts that are available, to get to the bottom of both the operational questions and also some of the policy assumptions, and lay that information before the country. I think it's stretching human nature too far to expect that Mr. Meese is going to be able to do that. He has questions of personal loyalty. I'd just like to suggest that maybe we're ready now for something like the Sam Ervin Special Investigating Committee that did.
You think it's that serious?
Well, I think it is serious. As I said, I don't know how serious it is. I'm like Hamilton Jordan. I don't welcome the unraveling of another presidency.
Not even that of a Republican named Ronald Reagan?
Jim, I didn't even push for the impeachment of Mr. Nixon 12 years ago. You may be surprised to hear that, but I wasn't in full cry for Nixon's scalp 12 years ago. I personally would like to see this administration reconstructed. I'd like to see some foolish policies re-examined, and that may be one of the blessed byproducts of this. We may be through with the business of backdoor financing of this Contra operation in Nicaragua, which is not a good policy in any event. I hope we're through selling arms to the most terroristic state in the Middle East, the Ayatollah's regime. I don't know how the administration can even suspect that it might be in our interest for Iran to win this war with the help of American arms, or with arms that we've helped to open up from other countries. Why would it be in the American interest to have the most extreme, radical, fundamentalist Muslim group in the Middle East triumph and then begin to move against the Gulf states and to sweep across that area? So I hope that what will come out of this is a re-examination of policy as well as an examination of procedure. I'd like to see us take another look at what happened at Reykjavik. That's far and away the most important issue, the question of arms control, bringing the nuclear race under control. I think we missed an opportunity to do that at Reykjavik, but I happen to believe that if he wants to do it, President Reagan can bring that about politically better than anybody else. He has the credentials to do it, and that's one of the reasons I hope he won't go down under this onslaught.
Norman Podhoretz in New York. Do you think this calls for another Senate Watergate-type procedure?
No, I don't, but I think it probably will get such a response from the Congress. Given what we know so far, I would say there is a radical difference between Watergate and this whole debacle. I find myself in unaccustomed agreement with George McGovern on the policy of selling arms to Iran and some of the other actions that we've learned about, although I have to say that the idea of getting the Ayatollah Khomeini to pay for the Contras has a certain bizarre piquancy and elegance. Nevertheless, as a passionate supporter of aid to the Contras, and as one who believes that this is a policy that is both right and in the interests of the United States, I would hate to see this whole business used, as Senator McGovern would like to see it used, as an excuse for jettisoning the policy and the support that was so dearly won from Congress only a few months ago. My feeling is that it would, to paraphrase Senator McGovern again, it would be stretching human nature too far to expect the Democrats and also the media to be restrained in the pursuit of this story. I suspect that the inquisitorial tone that you already hear in some of the columns you've quoted, Jim, will spread, and that many people will go in full cry after Ronald Reagan's scalp. I think, as many people have already said, that this poses not only a danger to the country, but also a danger to the Democratic Party. I don't think the American people are in a mood to see another presidency destroyed. I think the feeling will be that Ronald Reagan made a mistake or a series of mistakes, and other people have zealously tried to implement a policy in which he believes and which has a lot of support in the country, not like Watergate, where, as far as we know, it's not like Watergate. That is, no one seems to have pocketed any money. No partisan advantage was taken. What was going on here was a stretching of the rules and possibly, for all we know, illegal acts in behalf of what the president believed to be a fundamentally sound policy. And I don't think the American people will see this as a duplication of the sins of Watergate, and will not respond happily to a series of congressional investigations or sanctimonious and overheated rhetoric of the kind that was used, for example, by Anthony Lewis in the New York Times this morning.
Yeah. How do you feel about that, Hamilton Jordan? What would you advise your fellow Democrats in the Congress, particularly in the Senate, those who now control the Senate, how they should play this and what they should do?
Well, I find the Watergate analogy at this point premature and unfair, basically. In Watergate, you had a sitting president of the United States actively engaged in a cover-up of crimes committed by people in the White House. In this case, you have zealots in the White House pursuing a policy, possibly committing crimes, and no evidence that the president was involved or was aware at all. So I find the Watergate analogy at this point very premature. What would I advise the Democrats to do? Well, certainly to exercise their responsibilities of oversight in the Senate, but to do that with some restraint and some dignity. As was said, we all have an enormous stake in the success of any president. President Reagan is going to be president for 2 more years. It's in everyone's interest, certainly the interest of our country, that he be as good a president as he can be. Well, notwithstanding, he has to deal with this problem.
Let me just make clear that I'm not drawing the parallel with the Watergate scandals. What I'm suggesting is that we need the kind of a thoughtful, constructive investigation that the late Senator Ervin ran to get at the facts. I prefaced that by saying I hoped that President Reagan's presidency could be saved, that he can continue to be an effective leader. But I think if that's to be possible, we have to have all of the information out in front of the Congress. I personally think the Democrats in the Congress and the Democratic leadership has been very, very responsible. I don't see anybody dancing in the streets saying we finally got Reagan. Now, I do think there's a constructive byproduct that can come from this. I believe that, frankly, President Reagan was riding too high. I think he was getting away with unexamined policy judgments. I think that he or his administration were doing things that represented an end run around federal law, particularly this tortured and painful effort to get funds into the hands of the Contras at a time when that was illegal. Those things can't just be dismissed. But until those questions are answered and Congress plays the kind of a role that it was intended to play under the Constitution, which is as a co-equal branch with the administration, then I think you always have the danger that this kind of high-handed, apparently illegal conduct on the part of the president will go uncorrected.
I have to challenge the idea that under the Constitution, Congress is a co-equal partner with the president. Foreign policy is the province of the executive in our system, and I think one of the difficulties we've been seeing, not just in the Reagan administration, but really since Vietnam, has been an effort by Congress to manage foreign policy to a degree that is neither contemplated by the Constitution nor can yield an effective foreign policy. And I think this is one of the larger systemic questions that arises from this particular issue. I also think that you have here a situation in which it's hard to imagine the Reagan administration recouping. I say this with no pleasure, to put it mildly, but this kind of story becomes a sort of black hole that sucks everything else into it. It becomes difficult for anyone to to talk about anything else, to think about anything else, to pay attention to anything else. And since there is so much advantage of various kinds, political, psychological, vindictive, to be reaped by the opponents and adversaries and enemies of this administration, it seems to me inevitable that the drama is going to play itself out in a fairly disastrous spirit for everyone concerned.
And there's nothing that can stop that, Mr. Podhoretz, from your perspective?
My guess is that there is very little that can stop it, but I don't think that the course of events is all that foreseeable. I mean, I can imagine at some point a great upsurge of popular sympathy for someone like Colonel North. I'm not saying this will inevitably happen, but
sure.
The story, we don't know the full story. What we know is here was a man who was determined to implement a policy that the president was convinced and is convinced was right, that he had finally, after a lot of difficulty, succeeded in getting the Congress to back, and that in stretching the rules or even technically breaking the law, though I don't know that that was done, in the service of a policy that has already been ratified and that the president himself supports, is a very different matter from breaking the law for personal profit or stretching the rules for partisan advantage.
Hamilton Jordan, to pick up on Mr. Podhoretz's black hole theory, and also the point that George Will made in his column today, which is that the very reputation, the ultimate reputation of the Reagan presidency now hangs on this particular episode. And if you were to carry that the next step, you would say maybe Lyndon Johnson's presidency is remembered mostly now because of Vietnam, Nixon because of Watergate, yours in the Carter administration because of the Iranian hostage thing. Does this thing have the same kind of potential to put this kind of label on the Reagan administration?
It certainly has that potential, Jim. I hope that potential won't be realized. These stories gather a momentum, develop a life of their own. There are many different angles to this story. It's the kind of thing that will not be over quickly, probably should not be over quickly. These things have to be pursued. It'll be interesting to see how this administration, which has prided itself on its ability to communicate in public relations, it'll be interesting to see how they're able to handle this. This was a tremendous challenge.
But you won't go, you don't agree with Norman Podhoretz that the die is pretty much cast already.
Well, it looks that way now. I would probably agree with you more than disagree, but President Reagan has a reservoir of goodwill and popularity. It's at risk now. Can he turn it around? Can he come forward and come clean with all the facts, all the information? Will he make those adjustments or changes in his administration, whether it be policy or people, that will allow him to go forward for the next 2 years? I hope so. But if this story develops this life of its own, if we go into weeks and months, then I'd be concerned. That's why I resist both the Watergate analogy and the idea that we might have something that Senator McGovern suggested, a Watergate-type approach. I think that the structure of the Congress and the leaders of the various committees are fully able to address this thing. The idea of having a Watergate approach, again, draws that analogy, which I think is premature at this point.
Mr. Podhoretz expressed a perfectly valid point about concern as to whether the president can reestablish his leadership. Let me say, first of all, that I think a careful, thoroughgoing investigation is essential to do that. I don't think the president can function effectively as long as these unanswered questions remain. So
whether it's done by the Senate or whether whoever does it, it has to be done?
I'm not going to press for the Irvin-type investigation. If you can do it on the Foreign Relations Committee and the Armed Services Committee, there may be better vehicles by which to do it, but there has to be a thoroughgoing investigation other than one that is operated in-house by Attorney General Meese. This is not to say that Meese is a bad man. It's simply to say that he's a human being and his boss is the President of the United States. There's another major step that President Reagan could take to reassert his leadership in the foreign policy field, and I don't mind the president leading in foreign policy. I think he should, although I would insist that that congressional check is a very important safeguard. But if the president would step out on the initiatives he started at Reykjavik, where he came very close to getting an agreement to turn the arms race around, to bring this nuclear monster under control, and all he has to concede to get that is to agree to confine his Star Wars to research alone for the next 10 years. That's probably all we can do profitably anyway with that system. That's the way for the president to reassert his leadership.
You've opened up a whole lot. Yes, Mr. Podhoretz, quickly.
Yeah, I'd just like to say the only silver lining in this cloud, so far as I'm concerned, is that it may make just such an arms control agreement, which I think would be a disaster, less likely.
All right. On that note of disagreement, we will leave it, Mr.
That
McGovern.
may be one of the reasons some of the right wing is so anxious to all of a sudden get Mr. Reagan.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Hamilton Jordan in Atlanta, Mr. Podhoretz in New York, and Mr. McGovern here. Thank you. Charlene?